What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors faces off with late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington sits down for what was supposed to be a routine interview, only to find himself caught in an ambush that leaves viewers speechless and the entertainment industry reeling. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is the moment that exposed the dark side of late-night television and revealed exactly what happens when journalistic integrity collides with Hollywood arrogance. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you won't believe what happens when these two titans clash in what can only be described as the most explosive interview in late-night history. The Late Show studio felt different that night. Even before the cameras started rolling, an electric tension crackled through the air that the production crew couldn't shake. Stephen Colbert paced behind his desk during the commercial break, adjusting his tie with a nervous energy that suggested tonight's interview wouldn't follow the usual script. His producers had briefed him on the talking points, but something in Colbert's demeanor hinted that he had his own agenda brewing beneath the surface. Denzel Washington entered the studio with his characteristic dignity intact, nodding politely to crew members as he made his way to the guest chair. The two-time Academy Award winner had done countless interviews over his decades-long career and approached this one with the same professional composure that had made him one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. But as he settled into the burgundy leather chair across from Colbert's desk, there was no way he could have anticipated the trap about to be sprung. The show opened with Colbert's typical monologue, filled with political commentary and sharp observations about the day's events. The audience laughed, but those watching closely might have noticed that his jokes seemed more pointed than usual, his delivery carrying an edge, hinting at something brewing just beneath the surface. When the commercial break ended and the cameras focused on the interview, Colbert's smile seemed forced as he introduced his guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Denzel Washington," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a seasoned host. But anyone who knew Colbert well could detect a subtle shift in his tone, the way his words carried more weight than a simple introduction should bear. Denzel walked out to thunderous applause. Waving to the audience with genuine warmth, he shook Colbert's hand firmly, settled into his chair, and prepared for what he assumed would be a straightforward conversation about his latest film, projects, and perhaps some light banter about his illustrious career. The first few minutes proceeded exactly as expected, with Colbert asking softball questions about Denzel's upcoming projects and his approach to selecting roles. "You've been in this business for over 4 decades, Colbert began, leaning forward with what appeared to be genuine interest. "What keeps driving you to take on these challenging roles?" Denzel responded thoughtfully, discussing his passion for storytelling and his commitment to representing complex characters with depth and authenticity. His answers were measured, thoughtful, and delivered with the gravitas that had made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. The audience hung on every word, captivated by his presence and wisdom. But then something shifted. Colbert's next question carried a different tone, one that sliced through the friendly atmosphere like a blade through silk. "You know, Denzel, you've built quite a reputation as someone who speaks their mind," Colbert said, his smile unwavering but his eyes sharper, especially on political and social issues. "Some might say, you've been quite vocal about your traditional values." Denzel's posture changed subtly but unmistakably. His shoulders squared slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to signal that he recognized the conversation had shifted. Years of experience in Hollywood had taught him to spot when an interview veered into uncomfortable territory, and every instinct he possessed was now on high alert. "I believe in speaking truthfully," Denzel replied carefully, his voice steady despite the provocation. "I've always tried to be authentic in my public statements, just as I am in my performances." "Authentic," Colbert repeated, as if savoring the word. "That's interesting because some of your recent comments about faith, family values, and traditional morality have raised eyebrows in certain circles. Would you say those views align with what most people in Hollywood believe today?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and the studio audience seemed to sense the subtle shift in energy. What had started as a celebration of Denzel's career was beginning to feel more like an interrogation, and the veteran actor's expression hardened almost imperceptibly as he processed the implications behind Colbert's words. "I don't speak for Hollywood," Denzel responded, his voice gaining a slight edge. "I speak for myself and my own convictions. I've been blessed with a platform, and I use it to share what I believe to be true and meaningful." Colbert leaned back in his chair, his practiced television smile never faltering, but there was something predatory in his gaze. "Now, of course, but don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with that platform, especially when your views might be seen as exclusionary to certain communities?" The word exclusionary hit the air like an accusation, and Denzel's jaw tightened visibly. This was no longer an interview about his craft or career. It had become something else entirely. The audience, initially excited to see one of their favorite actors, now found themselves witnessing what felt more like a public trial than a late-night talk show segment. "I've never excluded anyone," Denzel said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years being careful with his words in public forums. My faith teaches love and acceptance. If people choose to interpret that differently, that's their prerogative. But I won't apologize for believing in something greater than myself. But surely you can see how some of your statements might be interpreted as judgment, Colbert pressed, his tone remaining conversational, even as his questions grew more pointed. When you talk about traditional family values, when you emphasize the importance of father figures and traditional marriage structures, doesn't that implicitly suggest that other family structures are somehow lesser? The trap had been sprung, and Denzel could see it clearly now. This wasn't about his movies, his craft, or his charitable work. It was an ambush designed to force him into a corner where any answer could be twisted into controversy. His hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, now gripped them slightly tighter as he prepared to navigate this minefield. What I've said is that children benefit from having strong role models and stable family structures, Denzel replied, his voice steady but carrying a warning undertone. I've never suggested that love comes in only one form, but I won't be shamed for believing that fathers have an important role to play in their children's lives. The audience had grown noticeably quieter. Sensing the tension building between the two men, what had started as entertainment was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and the energy in the room reflected that shift. Colbert, however, seemed energized by the conflict, pressing forward with the relentless determination of someone who had spotted blood in the water. But this was only the beginning, and neither man had any idea how much further the confrontation would escalate. The commercial break that followed felt like a momentary ceasefire in what had already become a battlefield. Colbert's producers huddled around him, whispering urgent instructions, while Denzel sat in his chair, composure intact, eyes reflecting the steel of someone who had been pushed too far. The makeup artists rushed to touch up both men, but the tension was so thick that even the crew moved with nervous efficiency, sensing something unprecedented was about to unfold. When the cameras rolled again, Colbert's demeanor had shifted into something even more calculated. Gone was any pretense of friendly banter or respectful discourse. His smile had taken on a razor-sharp quality, and his posture suggested a predator who had cornered his prey and was ready to move in. "Welcome back," Colbert said to the camera, his voice carrying a false brightness that fooled no one in the studio. "We're here with Denzel Washington, and we've been having quite an illuminating conversation about values and responsibility in Hollywood." The way he emphasized illuminating made it sound like an accusation, and Denzel's eyes flashed with a warning that any seasoned interviewer should have recognized. But Colbert seemed intoxicated by the conflict, driven by some internal need to push the confrontation past the point of no return. "Before the break, we were discussing your views on family structures," Colbert continued, his tone taking on the cadence of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "But I think what really interests our audience is how someone with your influence reconciles those traditional views with the reality of modern America. Don't you think your platform comes with a responsibility to evolve with the times?" The question was loaded with implications, and Denzel's response came with controlled fury that sent ripples through the studio audience. "My responsibility is to be honest about what I believe, not to conform to whatever the current social pressure demands," he said. His voice carried the weight of decades spent navigating Hollywood's political landmines. "I've seen trends come and go, but truth doesn't change with the times." "Truth," Colbert repeated, leaning forward with theatrical interest. "That's a bold claim. Whose truth are we talking about here? Because when you talk about traditional marriage, when you emphasize the importance of fathers in ways that seem to diminish other family structures, aren't you really just imposing your personal beliefs on others?" The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and Denzel's composure finally began to crack. When he spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge few had ever heard from the normally diplomatic actor. "Let me be very clear about something," Denzel said, his words measured but charged with a barely contained storm. "I have never, ever diminished anyone's family structure. What I have done is speak about the importance of fathers being present in their children's lives because I've seen firsthand what happens when they're absent. If you want to twist that into some kind of political statement, that's your choice. But don't put words in my mouth." The studio had grown so quiet that the hum of the cameras sounded unnaturally loud. The audience, many of whom had come expecting laughter and entertainment, now found themselves watching something that felt more like a public execution than an interview. Colbert's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully provoked his target, and he pressed his advantage with ruthless precision. "But surely you can see how your emphasis on traditional structures might be perceived as judgment," he continued, his voice carrying a mock reasonableness that made his attacks even more infuriating. "When you talk about the importance of marriage between a man and a woman, when you emphasize biblical values in your public statements, aren't you essentially saying that people who don't share those values are somehow living incorrectly?" This was the moment the interview shifted from uncomfortable to explosive. Denzel's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of a man who had reached his absolute limit. You want to know what I think is incorrect, Denzel said, his voice rising for the first time. I think it's incorrect for someone to invite me onto their show under the pretense of promoting my work, then ambush me with loaded questions designed to make me look like some kind of bigot. I think it's incorrect for a host to twist my words and misrepresent my beliefs to fit whatever narrative they're trying to create. The attack was direct and devastating. For the first time, Colbert seemed momentarily thrown off balance, but he recovered quickly, and his counterattack was even sharper than before. I'm simply asking you to clarify your public statements, Colbert said, adopting a tone of wounded innocence clearly calculated to inflame. If you feel ambushed by being asked to explain your own words, perhaps that says more about the words themselves than my questions. The implication was clear. If Denzel couldn't defend his statements, maybe they were indefensible. It was a classic media manipulation tactic, and Denzel recognized it instantly. Don't you dare try to gaslight me, Denzel said, his voice dropping into a dangerous quiet that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, and I've seen every trick in the book. What you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's character assassination disguised as an interview. The accusation hit Colbert like a physical blow. His mask of professional composure began to crack. His smile turned forced, his movements agitated, and when he spoke again, a note of genuine anger surfaced. Character assassination, Colbert shot back, his voice rising to match Denzel's intensity. I'm asking legitimate questions about public statements you've made. If you can't handle being questioned about your beliefs, maybe you shouldn't express them so publicly. And if you can't handle conducting an interview without turning it into a hit job, maybe you shouldn't be hosting a talk show. Denzel fired back, his composure gone. You invited me here to talk about my work, my craft, my contributions to cinema. Instead, you've spent the entire time trying to trap me into saying something you can use to destroy my reputation. The gloves were off, and both men were fully engaged in a verbal battle far beyond the boundaries of typical television discourse. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply leave. This was uncharted territory for late-night television, and everyone in the studio could feel they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. But the confrontation was far from over, and what happened next would push both men past any chance of reconciliation. Colbert's face had taken on a flush of anger. His makeup couldn't hide. The careful facade of the thoughtful host had completely collapsed, replaced by something raw and vindictive that even his own production team hadn't seen before. His next words came out with a venom that sliced through the studio. Let's talk about hypocrisy then, shall we? Colbert said, his voice dripping with malice. You want to lecture America about traditional values and family structures. But how convenient that you ignore the parts of your own industry that don't fit your narrative. How many of your colleagues live lives that contradict everything you claim to stand for, and yet you work with them? You profit from projects with them, all while pretending to hold the moral high ground. The attack was personal now, aimed not just at Denzel's beliefs, but at portraying him as a fraud. It crossed every line of professional courtesy. Denzel's reaction was immediate and explosive. You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, Denzel said, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. I don't judge my colleagues. I don't lecture anyone about how to live, and I certainly don't use my platform to tear people down the way you're doing right now. I speak my truth when asked, and I treat everyone I work with respect and dignity. Respect and dignity. Colbert scoffed, his professionalism completely gone. Is that what you call it when you make statements that alienate entire communities? When you use your influence to promote views many people find harmful and outdated. What I find harmful, Denzel shot back, rising slightly in his chair, is a host who thinks he can ambush a guest and pretend he's some kind of moral authority. You want to talk about harmful influence? Look in the mirror. You've turned what should have been a conversation about art and creativity into a public lynching. The word lynching hit the room like a thunderclap. It carried heavy historical weight and modern sensitivity, and its use sent a shock through everyone present. Colbert's eyes widened in outraged disbelief, and his response came with a fury that matched Denzel's. Don't you dare, Colbert said, pointing across the desk. Don't you dare use that word to describe being held accountable for your public statements. You came on this show as a public figure, and public figures get questioned. If you can't handle that, maybe stay out of the public eye. Question. Denzel laughed bitterly, shaking his head. This isn't questioning. This is character assassination pretending to be journalism. You didn't invite me here for a conversation. You invited me here to try to destroy me on national television. Well, congratulations. You've shown your true colors, and they're uglier than I ever imagined. The studio had fallen into a stunned, oppressive silence. What they were watching had drifted far beyond normal television discourse. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably. Others couldn't look away from the train wreck unfolding. But all of them understood this was unprecedented. Colbert's next attack was the most vicious yet, crafted to inflict maximum damage. You know what I think this is really about? Colbert said, leaning forward with predatory intensity. I think this is about an aging actor desperate to stay relevant in a world that's passed him by. You can't adapt to changing times, so you hide behind traditional values and pretend you're a moral beacon. But really, you're just afraid your outdated worldview makes you irrelevant. The attack was so personal and so cruel, it seemed to drain the air from the room. Even Denzel looked momentarily stunned. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet dignity that made his words cut even deeper. You want to know what's irrelevant? Denzel said, steady and unwavering. A host who thinks tearing down guests makes him important. A man who confuses cruelty with cleverness and thinks ambushing people makes him a journalist. You're not exposing anything about me. You're exposing everything about yourself. And it's not pretty. Colbert's face had gone pale, his hands trembling as the impact of Denzel's words settled over the room. But pride wouldn't let him retreat. And his final attack came with the desperation of someone who knew he was losing. At least I'm honest about who I am, Colbert said, his voice cracking slightly. I don't hide behind false piety and outdated moral posturing while secretly judging everyone who doesn't fit my narrow worldview. That was the final straw. Denzel stood abruptly, his chair rolling back from the force of his movement. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had reached his absolute limit and would not be pushed any further. False piety, Denzel said, his voice rising to fill the studio. Narrow worldview. Let me tell you something about narrow worldviews. A narrow worldview is believing that anyone who doesn't share your political beliefs deserves public humiliation. A narrow worldview is using your platform to attack guests instead of acknowledging their achievements. A narrow worldview is confusing cruelty with cleverness. He began, removing his microphone with sharp, decisive movements, each one a clear sign the interview was over. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Denzel continued, his voice carrying the weight of long experience and hard-earned wisdom. I've worked with people from every background, every belief system, every lifestyle you can imagine, and I've treated them all with respect. That's what decent human beings do. But I will not sit here and be disrespected by someone who thinks hosting a talk show gives him the right to attack people's character and beliefs. The microphone hit the desk with a sharp thud that echoed through the stunned studio. Colbert sat frozen, his face a mix of shock and something that might have been shame, though it was far too late for regret. This interview is over, Denzel declared, his tone final and unyielding. I came here in good faith to talk about my work and my craft. Instead, I faced a host more interested in destruction than dialogue. America deserves better than this kind of television, and I certainly deserve better than what I've received tonight. He turned to the audience, his voice carrying the same commanding presence that had defined his career. To everyone watching at home, remember this, Denzel said, scanning the stunned faces in the studio. When someone invites you to their table, you expect basic human courtesy. What you've seen tonight is what happens when that courtesy is thrown aside in favor of ambush, journalism, and character assassination. With that, Denzel Washington walked off the set of The Late Show, leaving behind a host whose credibility lay in ruins and an audience that had witnessed the collapse of what late-night television was supposed to represent. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Colbert's stunned expression and the heavy silence filling the studio like a suffocating blanket. As Denzel's footsteps echoed through the backstage hallway, it was clear something fundamental had broken, not just between the two men, but in the very fabric of public discourse itself. The confrontation was over, but its impact would extend far beyond that studio, marking the moment when respectful disagreement gave way to something far uglier and more destructive.